Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast. Today I have part one of a fantastic interview with Brandon DaCruz. He is an online nutrition and physique coach, internationally published fitness model, and National Level NPC competitor. He's also been featured in publications like Men's Fitness Magazine, Muscular Development, Bodybuilding.com, and the Alan Aragon Research Review, where he's been a contributing author. He's been in the fitness industry for over a decade, and in the last 10 years exactly, he's been extremely focused on his online nutrition, physique, and health coaching business. Today, I have him on the podcast to discuss a variety of topics pertaining to how you, dear listener, can make the most of a fat loss phase. First, we start with the criteria that he uses to decide whether a client is ready for fat loss. Then we delve into what kind of phase he implements prior to a fat loss phase in order to prepare a client to make the most of a caloric deficit and potentiate their long-term results. And finally, we end the conversation on planning fat loss phases within the context of a year or multiple years of chasing your fitness goals, and also on a shorter term basis, week to week, in order to get the best results possible. Brandon and I share a very similar coaching philosophy focused on creating an effective mindset to achieve your fitness goals, nurturing a great relationship with food and exercise, and obviously getting jacked and lean in a sustainable way so that you can maintain those results in the long run. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and if you're interested in learning more about Brandon, please check the links in the description below. Now, without further ado, let's get straight into it. Hey Brandon, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. I'm really glad that we got to link up and make this happen.
Yeah, agreed. And I'm really excited to get into today's topic, which is fat loss. But first and foremost, why don't you explain to everyone who you are, what you do, and why you're so awesome at it?
Well, I appreciate the compliment, so hopefully I don't let anyone down on this. But my name is Brandon DaCruz. I'm an online nutrition coach, and I literally have worked with every type of client you can imagine. It's funny, this January, so we're coming up 2 months from now. It'll be my 10th anniversary of actually starting my online nutrition coaching business. And in that time, I've worked with literally everyone from Olympia level IFBB pro bodybuilders and other professional athletes to lifestyle clients like moms and busy business owners to everyone in between. So it's really been a blessing with working with as many and as wide of a client population as I have, because it's allowed me to gain a ton of experience and knowledge to work with people of pretty much any background and any goal. And then in addition to coaching, I've also written articles and for publications like fitness magazines like Men's Fitness Magazine, Muscular Development, Bodybuilding.com. And actually, just recently, I wrote for one of my mentors, who's Alan Aragon, who has his own research review. And so, pretty much over the last 14 years, I've been working full time within the health and fitness industry. And in that time, I've literally done everything from in person training to being an executive in the sports nutrition industry. But the last 10 years, my primary focus has really been within online nutrition physique coaching. And actually, to go back to like how I got into this, I actually have quite a different entrance into fitness than many others that at least that I've encountered in this space. And I was a competitive athlete growing up and ended up becoming very involved and focused in weight restricted sports, including martial arts and then endurance sports, including like cross country, indoor and outdoor track. And seeing as all these sports have a very large focus on the weight control aspect to them, where being lighter was seen as being an advantage, I started getting told by my coaches early on in my athletic career that I needed to like watch my weight and my food intake, and I started getting very fixated on that, and it eventually caused me to develop an eating disorder. And I was actually suffering from what's now known as relative energy deficiency in sport. But at that time, the term reds wasn't even aware. It was a female athlete triad. They had no research on actually men and young men suffering from it. So it was something that there was very minimal information at the time. But essentially, I was in a situation where I'd pretty much be training for hours a day, and then I'd be underfueling that activity in order to keep my weight down and stay within my weight class. So, due to this constant, being in this constant state of low energy availability, I developed a ton of micronutrient deficiencies and hormonal issues, and it eventually led to a bunch of injuries in my early teens. And essentially, I had to go into a rehabilitation process for about a year where I wasn't able to get back into sports. I was unable to do a lot of the things that I loved, and so I put a large focus, put all the time that I was essentially investing into sports into the rehabilitation process because I was determined to do whatever I could to get back on the field. And luckily during that time, I was sent to a physical therapy facility that was run by two individuals. And I always say I was very lucky in this fashion because most of the time, when you get, especially in the states, when you get sent to a physical therapy facility or a chiropractic clinic, they're run by individuals who specialize more in non-athletic populations. But in my case, this facility was run by one doctor who was a bodybuilder and nutritionist, and the other who was a power lifter. So as I rehab my body, they taught me about the benefits of nutrition in terms of how like fueling your body could have so many benefits, as well as putting that in combination with resistance training for the essence of building my body. So I essentially went from doing the exact opposite. I was over restricting myself, undernourishing myself, and overtraining, and especially in an endurance capacity, to doing the exact opposite. And I think both of them to this day for that because they got me out of this mindset where I felt like I needed to constantly restrict everything, restrict my intake, and help me to view food as fuel. And they also kicked off my interest and my love for both nutrition and training, which has been my life's greatest passion at this point. So it's been my pursuit for well on going on 20 years at this point. So I was very fortunate that they got me into this interest and I was like 13 or 14 at the time. So I was very young. And due to the fact that I got this exposure and encouragement from them, and they were very academically minded, they actually they sent me to the boards at the time. So that was what was very prominent. So I was on the bodybuilding.com boards, I mean, right as I entered high school. And so I started my early training career essentially reading all these great articles from guys like Alan Aragon, Lane Norton, Lyle McDonald, and I really got interested in researching what I was doing and learning more about the process of physique transformation. So it was pretty much natural that, when I was deciding what to do with my life, that I found myself drawn to working in fitness. And I owe fitness so much. I mean, it saved my life first and foremost, but it's also given me a lifelong passion and also provided me with a career that I've literally had since I was in college. So I had not worked in any other industry except the fitness industry. And I've done all different jobs and had different backgrounds within it, but it's been literally my passion, my love, and then my sense of security for everything. So over those years, essentially, I've loved what I've been able to do in the fitness industry, and I love the fact that I've had a career in it and I've been able to have a positive impact. But as this industry has evolved and grown, I've noticed more and more things, and maybe I should call them issues that haven't sat well with me. Essentially, there's a ton of misinformation that's constantly being put out online. And there's a lot of coaching practices that have very little validity behind them. It's do as I say. There's a lot of coaches that just tell you to do something without any explanation. And so it's really impacted and shaped how I approach my own coaching and then how I put out information online. Because really, my goal, I always say this to clients, and when I get on a podcast, my whole intention on coming on podcasts, I think I've done around 150 podcasts at this time. And really, my intention with it is to bridge the gap between information research and application, because it's not enough to just know information and have no ability and no applicability of that information. And that's what I've been able to do, having worked with over 1,000 clients at this point. And another goal of mine is to really provide clarity on complex topics that are rife with misconceptions, misinformation, and just misunderstandings within this industry.
Thank you very much for that detailed introduction. So, first of all, congratulations on the 10-year anniversary.
I appreciate
And
it.
thank you very much for sharing so much of your story. It's actually quite interesting because I come from an eating disorder and over restriction background as well. I was assigned female at birth and I was raised in a very much weight loss oriented culture. So when I was a teenager, I was a little bit overweight and I decided that I was going to lose that weight. I became very, very good at losing that weight, but I had no knowledge of how to maintain my weight loss or
Mhm.
how to stop it. And I believe that if I went back to just what I was doing before, I would put the weight back on, which was correct. But I didn't know what to do instead of dieting. So I just kept dieting basically until it became quite dangerous for my own health. And recovering from that on my own, I discovered bodybuilding. And similarly to you, my first encounter with, let's say, evidence informed or evidence based bodybuilding was with Eric Helms.
Very
So
nice.
through that, I developed a love for bodybuilding. And as you said, fitness effectively saved my life. It helped me cope with gender dysphoria, which was the reason why I actually developed the eating disorder. Um, and then it helped me get a career, much like you did. And I've been building my own career for the last 3 years and looking up to other professionals in the industry like yourself, which is why I wanted to have you on the podcast, because I share the principles that you've just mentioned and the values that you have. And I really wanted to bring you on to be one of these leading voices in the fitness industry that can share both research and application of that research instead, and provide a counterpoint to these voices that, as you said, go do as I say, without providing any explanation. And one of these topics where there's so much misinformation is fat loss, which is
Mhm.
also one of the main reasons that clients want to work with me, and I'm sure also want to work with you. So let's delve into then fat loss phases, which will be the main topic of today and our next conversation as well, because this is part one of two, just so that the audience is aware. So, my first question for you is, let's say that a client comes to you with a fat loss goal. I'd like to know, what criteria do you use to assess whether they're ready to make the most of that phase? Or if you don't have any criteria, do you just start with fat loss straight off the bat?
Yeah, so I'm going to be honest with you. This is something, my approach to this has been something that is ever evolving, and it has certainly evolved since I first started coaching. When I got into this 10 years ago, anyone that came to me with a fat loss goal, I would throw them in a fat loss phase. And I have to tell you, at the time, evidence based practice or the evidence based scene wasn't as prominent anywhere near what it is today. So there wasn't as good of information. But then also, I didn't have the experience. So I just thought, you know, that anyone that had this fat loss goal, as long as I got them into an energy deficit, we know, that commonality where people say, eat less, exercise more. And that's truthful, but that isn't always useful, especially with certain clients and with certain clientele. And so, like you mentioned, one of the most common goals new clients come to me with is that goal of losing fat and getting lean because they want to improve their body composition, their health, and their confidence. And this is multifactorial. So we always have to realize, I always say we cannot separate physiology from psychology. So you have to, as a coach, and this is where I speak on the evolution, my approach to this has been ever evolving, but especially up until this point, my list of criteria gets deeper and deeper. And the reason for that is based on my experience with clientele. So, despite the fact that many have the desire to go straight into a fat loss phase in order to get to their goal of getting lean and getting, like, say, visible abs, that's generally something that's so common with clientele that comes to me. They're like, listen, I've never had a six pack and I really want to see visible abs for the first time in my life. Unfortunately, many of these individuals, they just aren't in the best position both physically and mentally to actually successfully achieve a lean physique due to a variety of reasons. And there are generally a few common situations new clients are in when they contact me. And a lot of times they don't realize this. So this is a big role of the coach. I take massive responsibility in my role as not only a leader within this industry, but as a coach to lead my clients, but also to educate them, especially at the front end. So a lot of individuals, they're in one of two situations from a physical and a nutritional perspective. They're either overfed yet undernourished, meaning they're eating enough calories, so they're getting enough energy in the system, but it's resulting in them carrying a higher body fat percentage than they'd like. So they don't have their body composition that they desire. So they think that dieting's the goal. Yet they're suffering from micronutrient deficiencies, which are often impacting not only their quality of life, how they feel, their energy levels, but also their hormonal health and balance. So these are things that it's reflective both in their biofeedback, so how they feel subjectively, but also on objective indices like on their blood work. So when I'm looking at their panels, often I'm seeing, downregulated thyroid production, maybe hormonal imbalances, maybe estrogen dominance with females. I'm seeing low testosterone in males or low free testosterone in males. And it's not that they're at this very lean state. It's not like they're suffering from metabolic adaptation, which would induce some of these downregulations in hormonal markers. It's more so that they're eating a sufficient amount of calories, but their nutrient density is not where it should be. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, I have a lot of people who they've spent years chronically dieting and they've undergone repetitive cycles of both weight loss and weight regain and haven't been able to strike enough of a balance in terms of their approach to not only maintain a lean physique despite years of trying, but they also don't have a good balance mentally in terms of their relationship with food. So in both of these situations, whether they're the overfed individual carrying a lot of body fat or someone that is leaner yet is constantly in a dieting cycle, they're both in a suboptimal state of health in terms of their metabolic, their internal, and their physical health. And then often these individuals also have a poor relationship with food, which results in these unhealthy eating behaviors. And what I generally see a lot is a lot of people will engage in, disordered eating behaviors, which wouldn't be clinically diagnosed. However, they have patterns of binge eating on the weekends, followed by over restricting. So it's like they're over restricting during the week when they're busy. I call this the weekday dieter. They're on point Monday through Friday, but they over restrict during that period. They get distracted or they're really trying to go balls to the wall. They're going 0 to 100. However, then on the weekends, when stress hits them or the accumulated fatigue from over restricting during the week happens, or they have eating events or they have social occasions, they overeat and then they try to compensate for that throughout the week. And so they're in this state where they're not physically ready for fat loss, like a fat loss phase, but they're also not mentally ready for an energy deficit and the inherent restriction that comes along with an extended period of being in a calorie deficit. Because we know that it's not just about how many, about stringing one day together in a calorie deficit. It's about a prolonged period of time to really accomplish that goal of effectively losing body fat. And then on top of that, many clients, and I'm sure you can attest to this as a coach yourself, a lot of people come to you and they might not be aware of this, but when you're looking at their feedback, and I have a very extensive check-in form and an evaluation form and consultation, I'll go through some of it with you. You notice that they're stressed out, they're fatigued, and they're also living a lower quality of life than they desire, which is why I take and refer to my coaching method as this health-centric based coaching method, because I believe in going far beyond just the X's and O's of calories and macros for nutrition and then sets and reps for training. My goal with every client that I work with is to improve their health and their habits, positively modify their behaviors, and ultimately optimize their lifestyle as a whole. As a lot of people think about fitness and they only think about what they do in the gym and in the kitchen. But that's only a few hours out of our day. You might train 1 hour a day, 5 to 6 times a week at most. You might prepare your meals a few hours a week. You eat maybe a few hours a day. However, there's so many more hours throughout the course of the day that impact and influence your ability to successfully lose fat or just improve your body composition as a whole, which is why as a coach I feel we must not only give a client what they want and what they come to us for, but also what they need. So for a lot of new clients, the last thing they need to do is go right into a fat loss phase, as it's important to realize that in order to set up a client for success in terms of losing fat, they need to start the diet in a good place, both physically and then also mentally. And so before I ever decide whether a new client is ready for a fat loss phase, I like to assess certain aspects and make sure that they're in the right place to start a diet. Because I found that with a lot of individuals, and even with many other coaches, they don't actually ask their clients or they don't ask themselves to think critically, like, are you truly ready for a fat loss phase? Everyone has goals, but a lot of times they're not thinking about the bottlenecks that might prevent them. And I understand that mindset. I've been there myself, believe me. And so I try to relate to others, and then I also try to educate them, and I really try to inspire critical thinking. And so I want them to not only think about, do you think you're ready, but also let's look over other parameters to make sure that we're not doing what you've done previously, which is pretty much a lot of people. And you'll ask about their experience. I go through their dieting history. That's the first thing I look at in terms of my criteria. However, a lot of people, they just jump into a fat loss phase without knowing or even considering if they're in the right place physically, physiologically, hormonally, metabolically, or even mentally, which is one reason why so many dieters struggle with losing fat and especially with keeping it off, because they didn't set themselves up to succeed. So there are a few, criteria or categories I like to assess prior to to taking on a client for fat loss to see if they're even ready for a fat loss diet. So, I'll go through different categories with you, but I always start first with training and nutrition because that's what my forte is. And that's what most people come to me for. So, just off the bat, the first thing, like I mentioned, that I look at is a client's dieting history. I like to find out when their last fat loss diet was, how it went. Like, were they successful? Did they struggle? What did they struggle with? And how long it's been. Because ideally, we don't want to start a dieting phase unless someone has been eating in a surplus or at least at maintenance for a consistent period of time and hasn't dieted for at least a few months. Like I want at least 4 to 6 months where they haven't been in this state of energy restriction, both physically and mentally. I also like to examine and assess a client's dieting experience because, along with finding out their dieting history, I want to know what their level of experience is with dieting because dieting is a skill and a lot of people overlook that. So, it's a skill that if you do it well, if you're successful in it and you apply the right principles and approaches, you will get better with it over time. So, if a client has successfully completed multiple fat loss phases in the past and has been able to adhere to a deficit for an extended period of time, it's generally an indication that they have a good foundation of habits that will serve them well in future dieting phases. However, if I have someone come to me and they're new off the bat, they have absolutely no dieting experience, where the dieting experience they do have is from like this chronic dieting, this yo-yo dieting, they have bad, um, poor behaviors around food, poor habits. They haven't really had successful fat loss phase in the past. So not only have they had physical limitations, but they've also had some mental limitations due to frustration, discouragement, things of that sort, or self-limiting beliefs. I need to work on those first. Those are bottlenecks that will come up if we don't address them first and foremost. So I'd rather, look at their anchors, the things that are holding them back, and work on those previous to going into goals that they have that we're going to need to have gotten over those issues first and foremost before we approach that goal. And then I also like to look at their relationship with food and their nutritional habits around food. And so I want to find out how their relationship with food is currently. Because if someone has a poor relationship with food, the last thing that's going to resolve the poor habits they've built around their eating behaviors is to enter an energy deficit. I always say you cannot improve your relationship with food by restricting food. So, given the fact that we're going to need to have some sort of restriction, fat loss phases inherently are a form of caloric restriction. So whether you're restricting your food choices, you're restricting your calories, you're restricting, say, the eating window that you're in, so you're utilizing intermittent fasting, it's a form of restriction. So if you don't have a good relationship with food and a good foundation of habits around your eating behaviors, it's going to limit you throughout the fat loss phase. Then from there, I look to assess both their body composition and their training. So, one thing that I really see that's quite common with clientele is a lot of people want to get this lean physique. They want a lean muscular physique, but they don't realize that getting a lean muscular physique not only requires getting lean, it also requires having muscle in the first place. So a lot of people have the desire to get leaner, but the goal physique that they have and they come to me with, like a lot of times I'm sure you get this, where people will send you pictures of their goal physique or someone that they aspire to look like, and they don't realize that this individual or their goal physique has a ton more muscle than they currently have in a surplus. So if you don't have that to begin with, most people aren't going to be able to increase or to build an appreciable amount of muscle mass in a deficit. If you're a newbie, yes, the process of body recomposition is very possible. But generally, I work with intermediate or advanced trainees, so it's not that it's impossible, but they're not going to physically transform their bodies in terms of muscle mass throughout the course of a fat loss phase. And so that's where we really have to take a step back and have a critical conversation with that clientele to see, listen, if you're not happy with the level of muscle mass you're at now, you're not going to be happier with it once we diet. And so with that, we have to make sure that they're in a good position to succeed and that they don't get to an endpoint. Because I've had so many new clients come to me and say, they've told me about their previous fat loss phases and the experiences that they've had, and also the successes and failures in their own opinions. And a lot of times the feedback that I get was, I was able to get lean for those that succeeded. So they were able to get lean, but they felt skinny, or they didn't have the physique they wanted because they didn't have the requisite level of muscle mass. So along with assessing their current level of muscle mass, their current body composition, I want to make sure that their training is both progressive and productive, because this is going to be the foundation to building and maintaining tissue. And so I need to make sure that that's in a proper place. They're utilizing a properly programmed training or resistance training program prior to going to the dieting phase, because we know as the energy deficit becomes larger and larger or extends longer and longer, it is going to have knockdown effects on training productivity as well as training progressions. And so I want to make sure that that's in a good place. And I also want to ensure that the recovery is well managed and in an optimal place prior to starting the diet, because it's inherently an energy deficit is a lack of energy, it's a lack of resources, so that is going to impair recovery. And then another aspect that relates to recovery that I assess is a client's current sleeping habits. And I think this is something that's so commonly overlooked. It's one of the first things I ask on one of my consult forms prior to taking on the client. And it's an aspect of our lifestyles that can be negatively impacted during a dieting phase. So if someone doesn't have their sleep dialed in prior to going into a fat loss phase, it's going to negatively impact their ability to effectively lose fat, as there's so many downstream effects that poor sleep can cause. So we see that, both, I'll tell you with my own experience, because I've been on stage 15 times and I've done numerous diets over the years, but also have worked with hundreds of individuals within this. We see a dysregulation in our appetite and satiety hormones, which can cause both increases in hunger, decreases in fullness, but then also it can cause an increase in calorie intake that can easily erase the deficit and put you in a state of positive energy balance. And then that surplus or that state of positive energy balance is also negatively compounded by several factors, because sleep loss causes downregulations in both hormonal and pretty much in the hormonal and metabolic environment, which decreases insulin sensitivity and nutrient partitioning, so that we're more likely to store extra calories that we eat as fat and less likely to lose fat and gain muscle, all which impact our body composition results. And we actually see this play out in research. There's numerous lines of research where what they essentially do is they put groups of individuals on the same calorie controlled fat loss diets. So we're talking the same amount of calories, the same food sources, the same protein intake, and then all other nutritional variables are kept the same, but one group is given a sufficient amount of time in bed, while the other group is given an insufficient time in bed. And generally, a lot of these studies are actually crossover studies. So it's with the same individuals. They're going through both arms of the research study. So we're able to isolate variables because each participant acts as their own control. And what we see is that those that when they're in the sufficient sleep group, so when they're getting adequate amount of sleep, they lose more weight from body fat and maintain more muscle, as compared to when they go into that insufficient sleep parameter. And we see that they lose far less fat and much more muscle tissue, despite the fact that in both interventions or in both conditions, they lost the same total amount of body weight. And that's where we really have to get back to the fact that fat loss is not just about scale weight losses, it's about the changes in body composition. We want to look for quality weight loss. We want to ensure that we're maintaining our hard earned muscle tissue and just preferentially losing body fat. And then the next category or the next criteria I'm always looking over, which is honestly commonly overlooked, is what is their health status? Like, what does this person's internal health look like? Because oftentimes I encounter or I'll see individuals who have ambitious body composition goals and they want to enter a dieting phase, yet they have no business doing so. And by that, I mean, they aren't in a healthy spot internally. Their sleep patterns, their habits are completely off. Maybe their training and nutrition isn't dialed in. And then, like, their biomarkers, like their blood glucose, their blood pressure, or the resting heart rate aren't even in a healthy range for inactive individuals. So they're not even meeting like the minimum standards. Whereas, there's someone that wants to take it to the next level and optimize their body composition. And really, when it comes down to it, plain and simple, if you aren't healthy, the last thing you should be looking to do is push your body to the extremes in a fat loss phase to try to improve your aesthetics. And this is why one of the first things I do with my new clients is I get them to track and send me objective metrics of their health. Because in a lot of places, I work with people all around the world. I love doing blood work. I love blood work analysis, doing lab work. However, it's not feasible for everyone, especially when they first come to you. So I want to go after the low hanging fruit that anyone can track, anyone can implement. And generally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have them track their blood glucose, their resting heart rate, and their blood pressure. And if these aren't in line at the start of the program or at the start of us working together, my focus in their programming from a nutrition, a training, a cardio, and a lifestyle perspective is going to be on improving health first. As I always tell my clients, a healthy body is a more responsive body. And I find that many overlook, the fact that if their internal health is not in a good place, their body is not going to grow muscle effectively, nor is it going to lose fat effectively. So we have to realize that in order to change our body composition, we need to apply stress to it in the form of both diet, training, and cardio, However, just because we add these variables into the equation, we put them into your programming, and I set you up with the most optimal training program, the most, quote unquote, optimal nutrition and cardio program, doesn't mean that you're going to positively respond to it, because we need to be able to not only take on these things and implement them into our lifestyles, but we need to be able to adapt to these stressors to see the results and the outcomes we're looking for. And the issue is, if your body is already stressed from, say, an internal health perspective, your body's already going under an excessive amount of stress, and it has so much stress to deal with that it's going to prioritize your survival. It's going to prioritize, those internal sources of stress over external stresses like training and dieting. And so you're not going to get the results that you're looking for. So the healthier our body is, the more likely it is to adapt to both our diet and our training, and the more likely we'll see the positive results that we're looking for.
Thank you very much. Superbly explained. And Brandon, honestly, you're just speaking my language. I take very much a holistic approach to my coaching as well. And dear listeners, Brandon obviously explained this in a lot of details. I just want you to have a few key points to take home. Essentially, when you're assessing whether you're ready for a fat loss phase, what you want to do is think about what your dieting status is. So when the last time you dieted was, and as well as what your relationship with food is at the moment, whether you have the skills to diet effectively in terms of, are you consistent with the right nutrition practices? Are you consistent with a training program? And where are your recovery abilities at? Are you able to recover from all of the stress that you're putting your body under with the program and that you want to put your body under with potential caloric deficits? And you also want to consider your internal health status. So if you have access to blood work, that would be great. But if you don't, you want to consider your current body composition and your current, even your current biofeedback, how you feel on a day-to-day basis. Do you have the energy required? Do you have mental focus? Is your body responding well to training and nutrition already, or is it not? And when you have the answers to these questions, then you can think to yourself, okay, I'm ready, or this is what I need to work on before I'm ready. And I really like that you're taking, Brandon, this fat loss phase in the context of long-term results. You're not just thinking, let's lose as much fat as we can in 12 weeks. You're thinking, okay, in the next 5 years, where do you want to be in the next 5 years? And what do we need to do to get there? Not just in these 12 weeks where we lose fat, but also how much muscle do we need to build in order to actually optimize your physique? It is definitely something I see a lot where people don't realize that if they want to see a lean body, they've got to have something lying under body fat, because body fat sits on top of muscle. Once the body fat is gone, if there's no muscle underneath, you're not going to look the way that you want. What do you think, Brandon?
No, absolutely. I think you did a tremendous summary right there. I appreciate it. But yeah, just to hit on a couple of things that you remarked on, there's a lot of people that are looking for quick fixes within our industry, and the
Yes.
thing is that we don't have a fat loss issue. A lot of times, people independently, like an individual, will think that they are metabolically resistant, or they're metabolically damaged, or their metabolism is broken, and it's a very isolated, case for them. However, we don't have a fat loss issue. We see that 6 out of 7 people that go on a fat loss diet do lose body fat. So about 85%
Hmm.
of those that engage in a dieting practice do lose weight. However, we see that the recidivism rate, so the ability to maintain the results that you got, is very, very small. So when we look at some studies on diet recidivism, or the potential or the rate of relapse in terms of weight regain, we see that within 1 year, generally 70 to 80% of individuals who have lost weight will regain all the weight that they lost and then some. Then within 2 years, that percentage goes up to 85. And then within 3 years, 95% of dieters who had lost weight previously will have regained all the weight that they lost, during that fat loss phase. And between 33 and 66% of them will regain even more weight than they started out with to begin with. And so really what it comes down to is not looking for shortcuts or quick fixes. And that's why I had a very long-term mindset. I always tell my clients that we are potentiating each phase. So when I speak about the reason why I have all this criteria, maybe people in your audience that maybe are newer to fat loss phases or they're used to a different coaching paradigm, realize that this comes from both research, but it also comes from experience. I have taken so many people through the process. And like I mentioned, my criteria has evolved because I initially was the coach that would take people on and think, oh, everyone can lose fat. I know, the physiology of fat loss. I know thermodynamics. I'm good at macronutrient manipulations and things like that. And that's why, at the time I did that. But then I saw that I was able to get people lean in 12, 16 weeks. However, I wasn't able to get them to maintain those results because I hadn't worked on the habit and behavioral aspect of their lifestyle. And it wasn't a sustainable thing. We can't live in an energy deficit. What we need to realize is that fat loss phases are a part of our nutritional periodization plan. They are a phase, they're a phase specific goal. However, you are not to live in a deficit for the rest of your life. And if you need to do so, or you feel that you need to do so in order to maintain the physique that you desire, either it may be an unsustainable or unattainable physique for you. Maybe you're trying to stay far too lean for your, say, lower intervention point, which a lot of people will refer to as a body fat settling point, but we know that it's more correct to say a lower intervention point. There's something called the dual intervention model. So we
Hmm.
have essentially a body fat settling range that we can go between a high intervention point and a lower intervention point. And if you're trying to stay like, I work with many competitors over years, some of them want to stay shredded and it's just not realistic. However, what I see more common as to why people can't maintain the results that they've gotten is because they only focus on that end goal. They only focus on the outcome and they don't focus enough on the process. And I try to reinforce my clientele. It's so much more about the process and about cementing positive habits, modifying the behaviors that are holding you back and implementing new ones. So swapping out habits that are not serving you and replacing them with things that are going to serve you long term. So let's learn throughout the process of dieting so that you can live a life of greater abundance in that post dieting phase when we're increasing calories. But you have all these great habits and behaviors around your training, your nutrition, your activity, your movement, even your stress management, your sleep, where it's going to help you maintain the results that you got so that you're able to maintain a lean, healthy physique long term. And so I love that you said that I'm not looking at 12 weeks. I always tell clientele that come to me, listen, first and foremost, I could have a transformation with you in 8 to 12 weeks. We have the skills, and if you have the body, we can make it happen. However, I'm not concerned with that. At this point in my life, I'm not chasing, or this point in my career, I'm not chasing physique transformations. I don't need to be like other coaches posting before and afters because I've already done this for so long. What I'm looking for is lifestyle transformations. And what I mean by that is I'm trying to help clients better themselves and improve both physically and mentally, but also from a habit and behavior aspect so that we're not only able to get results, but we're able to maintain them. That is gratifying. And so I'm always looking at things, I'm projecting them out. So I have a very long term mindset on things that, yes, maybe we're doing a 12-week dieting phase, but I'm more so concerned with where we're at 12 months from now. And so it's always long term. We take short term goals and we'll work on them to keep a client motivated and really engaged in the specific phase. But it's always with the knowledge and education that this is just fat loss is just this phase. And then we will go into, say, a maintenance phase and we will go through different phase specific goals to potentiate the next. And that's why a lot of times when people come to me, if they're not ready for fat loss, I'm going to take them through a completely different phase and I'm going to set them up for success. And because that's going to potentiate the ability for them to be successful in their next phase in terms of fat loss itself. They're going to get the body composition results they want, but it's also going to set them up long term later on down the road once fat loss phase ends and once they're out of the deficit.
Thank you for putting a bow on this part of the conversation, Brandon. Actually, hopefully, my audience will know everything you've just mentioned because it is the main topic of the very first episode of this podcast, where I talked about an effective mindset for fat loss, which is essentially what you've just spoken about. So rather than repeating what you just said there, I'm going to use what you said as a segue into my next question, which is you said that when somebody isn't ready for a fat loss phase, you have them go through a completely different phase to potentiate a future fat loss phase. Can you speak more about that? What kind of phase is it and what does it involve?
Absolutely. So if a client doesn't meet the criteria that I spoke about previously, and it's clear that they aren't ready for a fat loss phase, what I'll do is I'll use a primer phase, which is essentially what I used to refer to as like the prep before the prep. And that's what I refer to it with my competitor clients, or I'll refer to it with my lifestyle or general population clients as a primer phase, or you guys can think about it as the diet before the diet. And this is essentially a preparatory phase. And it's honestly something that many overlook when fat loss is their goal. And I think it's one of the biggest mistakes that many make from the onset of their client's fat loss phase because they don't prioritize this. And the primer phase is essentially where I aim to improve, optimize, and set up a client's physiology and psychology so they respond better and can lose fat more effectively once we do decide to enter an energy deficit. And what we have to realize is there are so many physiological and psychological roadblocks and obstacles that many will encounter during a fat loss phase. And this is often going to create stalls and will cause them to either get discouraged, or they'll quit, which is why I'll never go into a fat loss phase with a client if they're not in a good spot, both from a physical and a mental health perspective, as I truly believe a healthy body is a responsive body, especially when it comes to fat loss. So if you're not in the right place, you shouldn't force it, whether it's, you're not in a good place stress wise within your life. You have a lot of work responsibilities. You are, starting a new family. You just had your first child. We have to take all these things into consideration. So that's why I always hit on it's both physical and mental. We have to consider both because someone could be in a great position physiologically. They could have been in a building phase for a significant period of time. They could have their sleep dialed in. They could have great productive training. However, everything else in their life, shit is hitting the walls. You know what I mean? And so they're not in the right place where it's not going to potentiate their ability to make progress within that next phase. And they're going to hit unneeded and unnecessary roadblocks that they wouldn't have hit if we just were a little bit more cautious. We took a step back, we analyzed things more, and we decided, listen, right now would it be great from a physical perspective for us to go into a fat loss phase, but from a lifestyle perspective, it just doesn't align with what you have coming up in the next coming months. So let's put a pause on that, work on a different phase specific goal, and then we can revisit the fat loss phase when life is in a position where you're more able to adhere to the diet itself and to hit all the other daily checklists or the daily to dos that you would need to be able to effectively lose fat and improve your body composition. And the issue is many individuals aren't in the right state, both physically and mentally, to start a fat loss phase, and they end up rushing into it. But this often leads to them falling off the diet or not complying, or even worse, they'll go through the diet, they'll go through a crash diet, but then they end up gaining back all the weight they lost right after finishing the diet because there was no focus on habits, behaviors. There was no focus on sustainability. And so this leaves them in a position where they got to their end result, but it was almost like, they got there, they hit like the final destination, they ran through the finish line, and now they were done. And they had no afterthought, they had no plan B, they had no post diet plan. And that's what we really see is an issue, especially in terms of weight loss maintenance. So, what I do with the primer phase and why I utilize it is because it helps me make sure a client is both in the right place physiologically and psychologically, which increases their likelihood of succeeding in both the fat loss phase itself and then the maintenance phase after. And so, I find this to be extremely beneficial and I utilize it with a broad base or a broad array of clientele, but especially it's really helpful when someone has, say, a long history of chronic dieting. Another situation is when someone has gotten themselves into situations with crash dieting or crash diets in the past or overly restrictive diets where they've been on extremely low calories and they can sustain that. You know what I mean? They're able to do it, but they're able to get lean, however, they're not able to sustain it. Or
Mhm.
they were on very, very low calories, but they didn't get as lean as they wanted. So they had really no other option. They kind of were running out of cards because what they were going to have to do to get any leaner wasn't going to be sustainable. Or, you know, people with hormonal issues, people with metabolic issues. And this could be, like I mentioned previously, this could be metabolic issues caused by either undereating or overeating. So this covers a wide spectrum from, having a suppressed metabolic rate and multiple nutrient deficiencies to having insulin resistance and issues with blood sugar management. And then other people that I find this to be really beneficial with is those that have, psychological issues in terms of their relationship with both the scale, food, and their body weight. And so, really, my whole viewpoint, I try to take a very all-encompassing view as to fat loss phases and coaching in general. I really do think that coaching is far more than just nutrition and training. And so, my mindset with this is if we don't address these issues initially before going into the deficit, the chance of these issues getting worse is amplified, which is why I'd rather focus on improving upon these roadblocks and these behaviors and these limitations so that they don't limit a client's, ability to make progress in the future as they have so many times in the past. And that's another thing that I go through with their history with dieting. Like, what has held you back in the past? Why haven't you, why are you contacting me? Because oftentimes, if a client's contacting a professional or a coach, they're looking for support, they're looking for advice, they're looking for guidance, but it's also because they've had, poor experiences in the past. And I specifically asked within my consult form, how many coaches have you worked with in the past? And every year I run statistics and analytics on these feedback that I get from my client consults. And last year, 2021, the average person that came to me for coaching had worked with 5.6 coaches before. So obviously that's not an even number. We'll round it up to six, but had worked with six professionals beforehand. So it wasn't that they hadn't, reached out to professional guidance. It was that the methods, the principles, and the protocols that were put into play with, from these coaches to these individuals wasn't right for them. And so they needed additional help. So I want to know about their previous coaching experiences. What was positive? What was negative? What were things that they saw that weren't sustainable for them? Or what other limitations did they have physically, mentally, lifestyle wise that really held them back from succeeding in something that they're very, if someone has died multiple times, it's because they have a passion or they have truly a desire to hit a goal. And so my purpose with this phase is to target a few of the following goals with my clients to improve them both physically and mentally prior to starting the diet. So, from the physiological side, I'm aiming to first improve their metabolic health. So, what I do is I do something called a high flux lifestyle. This is something that I've been utilizing with clients for years because essentially what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get them to eat as much as possible while maintaining their body weight so that when we do enter a fat loss phase in the future, we start at the highest calorie intake possible. And the goal here is literally to put their body in a place where it's constantly and consistently well fueled and gets used to processing and partitioning nutrients well, which puts this client in the best place to succeed in future dieting phases. And then with this increase in calorie intake, I'm going to have a more properly periodized resistance training program, which allows me to help them gain lean mass, increase their metabolic rate from the increase in food and the thermic effect of feeding that comes with that, but also the additional muscle mass that they've put on. And then with that increase in food, we're having more effective and productive training. And they're also going to have higher energy levels throughout the day. And so they're going to be more active. They're going to be able to raise their NEAT levels. They're not going to feel, this lack of energy and this lethargia that many of them come to me with. I'm also, from a nutritional perspective, looking at improving, food quality and nutrient density because I find that so many people come to me with micronutrient deficiencies, which are often the underlying causes as to why they lack energy. They don't feel well, or they have hormonal issues, among other problems, which I look to manage and improve upon during this phase through an increase in food variety and micronutrient availability prior to going into the deficit. I'm also looking to improve their digestion. There's many people that they either have issues with digestion or they completely ignore it. And what we have to realize is we aren't what we eat, but rather what we, digest, absorb, and assimilate, which is often impaired, limited by impaired digestion. So really need to focus on that first because a lot of people experience, issues with digestion motility during a dieting phase. And so I want to make sure that that's in an optimal state before we go into an energy deficit. And then also, along with everything else from a physical capacity, I'm looking to improve their aerobic capacity because that's going to improve their health markers like their resting heart rate, their blood pressure, their fasted blood glucose. So we're going to see an increase in insulin sensitivity and their carb tolerance. And we're going to be able to make sure that they're in the best state physiologically prior to us starting this energy deficit. And then from the mental side, often what I'm looking to do based on the clientele that I receive or that come to me is I'm looking to improve their relationship with food and then also their outlook on nutrition because I find this to be really helpful from an adherence perspective. And especially when I'm able to get someone away from a black and white mentality around food. And so this is where I'm really looking to focus on the behavioral aspect of a client's nutrition and how they approach eating, both from a physical and mental, perspective. And along with that, I'm looking to improve their stress management skills. And this is pivotal because stress, a lot of people don't realize we don't have all these separate buckets for stress. It's an allostatic load we have. So it's not like your training stress is in one bucket, your dieting stress is in another bucket, your lifestyle stress is in a separate bucket, and your work stress is over here. It's all one bucket that it pours into. So when you don't manage stress well, there's so many negative effects that stress can manifest as. We'll see lower sleep quality, we'll see higher cortisol levels, we'll see higher rates of insulin resistance, and that'll impair nutrient partitioning and metabolic flexibility. And we also see, like I mentioned previously with the sleep loss, is we'll see a loss of muscle mass and increases in fat mass, which will also come with decreases in training performance. So overall, this, primer phase allows me to set up clients to be in the best spot to succeed in their future fat loss phases, rather than just jumping into a deficit and hoping they respond without any prior preparation.
Thank you. I find it striking how similar our methods are. You call it a primer phase. I run a very similar phase, and I call it a kickstart phase.
Very nice.
And listeners, for you, what you want to take away, regardless of how, well, you can call it whatever you want for all I care. You, the listener, if you want to call it uh, candy phase or prep phase, whatever you like, I don't care. But what you want to take away from it is that you want to think about what you struggled in the past with in regards to fat loss as a wealth of knowledge. Most people think of it in really negative terms. They are disappointed and dejected that they have so much in successes, but those are all learning experiences. So as you said, Brandon, you know, listener, from what you did before, what it is that you struggle with, what your current barriers are with your habits regarding nutrition, your training. Maybe you're not consistent with a training program. You know that maybe you don't sleep well, so your habits as it pertains to your lifestyle. And then during the primer phase or kickstart phase or the candy phase, you want to work on these barriers that you have to put yourself in the best spot possible to succeed, just like you said, Brandon. Now, if we're ready to move on, I want to be respectful of your time. I know we've got about 10 minutes left.
Mhm.
Are you happy to, do you have time for just one more question, or do you think we
Absolutely.
should wait until the next time?
Yeah, let's go into the next question by all means.
Okay, so now we have put in place this primer phase for these imaginary clients. So they are ready for a fat loss phase now. I want to know, how would you plan a fat loss phase? And not only in terms of how long you keep a client dieting, but also, do you run a deficit straight through? Do you introduce periods of time when calories are increased to maintenance? For example, in a previous episode I recorded, I talked about diet breaks and maintenance
Mhm.
phases. I would like to know what your approach is and your thoughts are on any such approaches to a fat loss phase.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just from a broad-based perspective, because we're starting at the primary phase, I'll just give you my philosophy on what what we refer to as nutritional periodization, which is
Yes.
a philosophy I'm very big into, and it's essentially, I like taking a strategy or a strategic approach to planning my clients' diets, and I use different phases throughout the course of a year that are focused on specific outcomes, like the goal of losing body fat or maintaining that fat loss or restoring and improving health and building muscle that all potentiate one another so that I'm able to get a client to their long term goal in a more efficient, yet less redundant manner. Meaning, a lot of people stay into one phase for far too long. And I think it's really important to hit on this. And the reason I wanted to go into nutritional periodization to prelude, the fat loss phase is because a lot of people do the same things over and over again and expect a different result. And we can't do the same things dietarily or training wise year round and expect a different, yet alone better result. So not only is this ineffective way of going about any physique goal, but it's also unhealthy and unsustainable method, as there are inherently negative side effects and drawbacks that come with pursuing any of these extremes. So whether it be fat loss or muscle gain for a prolonged period of time, which is why whenever I have someone come to me with a long dieting history, I'll never, or someone that just say they just recently completed a diet, I'm never going to put them right back into a deficit because the body's extremely adaptive. So eventually, what has been working for you will stop working for you, which is why I consider and I found nutritional periodization to be so common. So, just a simple example of how I would periodize, like say over the course of a year or more of a long-term periodization setup, is I would go from that initial primer phase, as we discussed. So, I got someone in a very good spot physiologically and they're ready for fat loss. Their goal is still fat loss, and we have potentiated and put themselves in a place to succeed. So then we enter the fat loss phase. But then once our fat loss goal has been achieved, I'll transition them into either a reverse diet, a recovery diet, or a maintenance phase. And this is all going to depend, like, these are interchangeable essentially because it's really going to be client specific. So it's going to depend on how long the diet was, how lean they got, and what their future goals are. And then once they've recovered from that diet, we'll usually go into a building phase and then possibly a mini cut, phase after. So I find that the process of nutritional periodization allows us to focus on what needs to be done in a specific phase to get a client to their short-term goal, as I mentioned before, such as in the cases of fat loss phase, where losing body fat is the main goal that's being pursued. However, taking this periodized approach, also means that there are times that we focus on recovering from the stresses that we imposed during previous phases, like where we pushed hard to elicit a specific adaptation, in terms of fat loss. We'll have that maintenance phase, we'll have that recovery phase, or in a building phase, we've been at a surplus for a long period of time. If we see that we're accumulating body fat, or that we're inducing, higher levels or higher rates of insulin resistance, our blood glucose is climbing, that's where utilizing a different phase, like a mini cut or a cleanup, is extremely beneficial. And so when it comes to fat loss phases specifically, what I try to do, and it's really going to be client dependent because I work with people from all different backgrounds, goals, whether it be, professionals that are competitors, or it be just lifestyle clients that are just trying to lose 50 pounds to, you know, rid themselves of insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, anything like that. But really, generally what I see is at the start of a diet, you can afford to lose at a higher rate of loss. So you're able to diet a little bit more aggressively. And so what I generally will do is I'll start things off with a more assertive and effective deficit, and we'll take a faster rate of loss per week than I will later in the dieting phase. And this is for a multitude of reasons. We have to consider, where's the client at when we first started dieting phase. And the only generality I can really say for all of my clientele that come to me and that I put into a fat loss phase is they're either ready to diet, or I've gotten them ready to diet because we've done a primer phase. So if we look at the commonalities between all of these clients, we see that their body fat levels are at their highest because they've been in a surplus or at maintenance for a consistent period of time. Their calories are high, and we have plenty of room to pull from. Their hormones and their internal health are in an optimal state because they either came to me in that fashion, or better yet, we put them through the primer phase and we improved upon their health metrics. Their motivation is at a high point because they're at a point where we've really spoken about, do you really, like, is fat loss really your goal? What is your intrinsic motivation? Are you doing this for yourself, or are you doing this for the gram? Like, we have all these conversations. Hunger is at its lowest because they've been eating at a calorie surplus, for a consistent period of time. So they don't have all these issues with appetite regulation and hunger hormone signaling. Their work capacity has been built up through the course of that building phase. The recovery is in a great place, and they're so much less likely to lose lean mass at the start of a diet. So at the beginning of the diet, they'll lose at a higher rate of loss. So I might go for 1% rate of loss per week in the initial phases. And I'm going to, but I always make sure that I'm assessing biofeedback both in subjective markers and then objective markers. So subjectively would be, how are you feeling? What are your energy levels like? How's your libido? Things of that sort. But then also objective markers, like, what is your training performance like? Are you still taking rep progressions, load progressions? Are you able to maintain your intensity in the gym? What is your RRR like? What is your perceived effort like? So there's both subjective and objective markers. And so over the course of a dieting phase, I'll essentially use a decreasing weekly rate of loss. So we might start off at 1% per week, rate of loss per week, but towards the end of a diet, it might be under 0.5% per week. So on average, generally what I see is most clients over the course of the fat loss phase will be at between 0.5 to 0.75% of rate of loss per week, but it's going to be descending essentially. So I want them dieting less aggressively towards the end of the diet when they're more susceptible to higher levels of accumulated fatigue, both from a dietary and a physical perspective. But then also, I'm including more of intermittent dieting strategies. So when it comes to you asked about my approach to, say, diet breaks and refeeds. When it comes to these type of approaches, I implement them in an regulated manner, and it's all based on biofeedback. And it's going to be based on how a client is feeling, how are they responding. But also, I also like utilizing them as a plateau buster. So if I see that fat and weight loss has plateaued and they're stalling out, it's usually an indication that their total daily energy expenditure has decreased. So what was once a deficit is now their maintenance intake. Or it could be, and I'm very honest and open with my clients, and I ask that of them as well. Are you slipping? Are you having struggles with adherence, with calorie tracking inaccuracies? Have you slipped off the diet? Like, let's have these conversations. But in either case, they're at a stall. And so we need to do something to revitalize the process. And so I find that both refeeds, which would be, say, 2 to 3 days at maintenance calories, or diet break, which would be, say, 7 to 14 days at maintenance intake again, is an effective method to reset and refresh a client during the fat loss process. So these are going to be done. I don't ever pre-prescribe things. It's not like I tell a client, hey, every 4 weeks, we're going to take a 1 week diet break. I don't find that to be good from a psychological perspective, because sometimes they just hang on that rather than really focusing on the day-to-day tasks, the day-to-day process. But also from another perspective, the only time I do program them in is, say someone has a vacation coming up. We know that. All right, well, we're going to pull back. So I'll give them the mindset, we're going to push for, say, 2 more weeks. We're going to pull back during your vacation to accommodate your lifestyle and the changes that are going on, within your family life or your business or whatever it may be. Or if I see that a client comes to me that they have a really stressful week at work and they had, stuff hit the fan, and we didn't plan for them. They're not in a plateau. However, I know that their stress levels are so much higher than they've been previously. That's where I might utilize a combination where I deload them, and then I also implement a refeed or diet break. And so that's why I take more of an auto-regulated and more of a reactive approach to coaching, because I used to program things years ago in a proactive manner. I had these spreadsheets and I had everything listed out, and that's not how life works. And we have to realize I say this with a great amount of humility. I am very experienced as a coach, but I'm not a mind reader and I can't read the future. And I wish I could. And a lot of clients want that. A lot of clients will come to you and be like, well, what are we going to do at week 8 of this fat loss phase? I can't predict that. I've worked with thousands of individuals. However, I need to get to know you, your body, your psychology. And then also, if you can't predict 8 weeks from now what your lifestyle is going to be like, how can I? And so we're going to take it week by week. This is going to be an ongoing process. I'm going to learn you more. And then also, I'm going to implement strategies that are customized for you rather than utilize these cookie cutter prescriptive programs that are set in advance. And these are these set and forget programs that it's going to happen whether you need it or not. Or even if you needed a deload at week 4 rather than week 6, well, it's programmed as a 6-to-1 paradigm on my training program. So you're going to have to push through week 4. No, that's not the case. This is reactive coaching. Real world coaching is about responding and adjusting to the client's needs, their changes in lifestyle, their stresses, their biofeedback, their responses week to week, not on these long periods where it's set and forget programming.
Thank you, Brandon. I think that's a splendid way to end part 1. I think, in my opinion, the biggest takeaways from these podcasts are, first of all, dear listener, remember that a fat loss phase is only one phase in the entirety of your fitness journey and in the entirety of your life. And if you want to make the most of it, you want to have everything that we talked about today ready before you get into it. And then the second main takeaway is that every tool to achieve your fitness goals can work, unless we're talking something really crazy. But you need to find the method that works for you, because you're an individual. You're not an average that studied in research. You are one person with your own life history, your preferences, your needs, and your goals. And if you find that method that works for you, then you're going to see the results that you want. Do you agree with that, Brandon?
Absolutely, my friend.
Awesome. Thank you very much for being so generous with your time. And listeners, we'll speak to you next time. Thank you for listening to part 1. I hope you took a lot from it and that you let me know in a comment or with a 5-star review. As I said at the beginning, check out the links in the description to link up with Brandon, and he'll be back next week for part 2, where we'll talk more about the physiology of fat loss and how to set up an effective fat loss diet. If you're interested in coaching with me, I currently have dwindling spots available. They're being taken up very quickly. So if you want to work with me, please fill out the application linked below, and I look forward to hearing from you. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.